Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Yeah, it is The Law Show on CL 650, and we're speaking about immigration law. We have Gordon Maynard and Alex Stojcevic here from MKS Law in Yaletown, the boutique firm that specializes in immigration and citizenship law. And we're talking about express entry. Now, before the break, we got a 30,000-foot sort of view, and I like the way you described it with the different kind of pools. You have to be invited. It seems really quite complicated, and that's why we have the big brains here today. But there was... give us a little bit of background, because there's a Chamber of Commerce report that has just come out within the last month that we're going to talk about. But a big part of this was impacted because of the foreign workers that were allowed to come in, and this was headline stuff. I'm thinking off the top of my head, Tim Hortons. There was the Royal Bank, I believe, was implicated in this.
There were 4 cases.
McDonald's, yeah. Okay, good. Get into that.
Four big cases. One that I was actually involved with quite closely. The first was HD Mining, when a consortium of Canadian-registered, Chinese-owned mining companies attempted to legally and lawfully bring in 200 Chinese miners to work in a proposed underground mine in Tumbler Ridge. This caused several labor unions to band together and to sue in federal court, make all kinds of claims that ultimately proved to be baseless, that these workers, the companies had advertised in Mandarin only, for Mandarin only speakers, not for English speakers, and it cut out Canadians from the opportunity to actually work in this mine when nothing could be from the truth. That was the first case, and that ended up being mired in federal court for 6 months. The company ultimately won because they did everything right. They followed all of the rules. But the government got so much negative press that it really caused them to retrench and change their attitude towards the temporary foreign worker program. And the ultimate result in the summer of 2013, when a second case after HD Mining came up, it was RBC's iGate. RBC had outsourced to a company called iGate a number of Royal Bank of Canada employments in IT. These were full-time jobs that an IT company that was ultimately owned by an Indian consortium, even though it had local ownership in Toronto, took all of these people who were laid off and outsourced their jobs to India.
There's a call center too?
There was a call center as well. And what happened was in that case, CBC has a show called Go Public that received calls about this. And once they ran the show, they had thousands of people phone in and send emails about why is RBC outsourcing jobs.
Making $3 billion a quarter or something like
this,
right?
Right, so there was that. And then finally, the nails in the coffin were the 2014 stories in the spring of 2014, and there were 2 of them. There was a story on Go Public again, where a fellow who had been passed over being a supervisor at a McDonald's in Victoria went to Go Public because he had been passed over supervisor jobs for foreign workers, people that were here allegedly supposed to be filling a shortage, were being promoted instead of him. And he said, look, I'm looking for a $12 an hour supervisor position. I think it's unreasonable that I be passed up for people who are only here temporarily. That story got an amazing amount of
That's the one
coverage.
I remember. I thought it was Tim Hortons, but it's McDonald's.
Well,
yeah.
then, but right after that,
okay.
several other Tim Hortons, this very similar thing happened with in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, and then as a result, the government effectively, for a short time, shut down the temporary foreign worker program completely, didn't allow any applications until they rolled out in June of 2014 much more restrictive temporary foreign worker program that imposed a $1,000 fee where a fee was quite minimal before that, where advertising requirements were increased from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. Transition plans were added where a company had to commit to transitioning its workforce to Canadians. Quotas were imposed where there were limits on the number of foreign workers that any one company could bring in. And this has ultimately resulted in a 45% drop in temporary foreign workers being issued labor market impact assessments over the system that existed before June of 2014.
So how does that story, that package of stories, affect what we're talking about here, which is the express entry system.
let's-
So how do we tie those together?
I'm going to let Gordon now tie those together, because they're actually tied together in quite a profound way, and that's the main source of the complaint that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has with the immigration system.
In June 2014, when the government rolled out the revised, overhauled LMO process and called it LMIA, it wasn't just a change.
What was LMO before? What was the
Labor market
Labor
opinion.
market opinion.
Okay,
Now it's
right.
a labor market impact assessment.
assessment? Right.
Just give it a new name. Yeah.
It's essentially the same process.
Right.
But that became a tool to restrict the entry of foreign workers, to diminish the permissions for bringing in foreign workers.
So it's an excuse to say no.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And it wasn't just the requirements that they put in place, it was the complete mindset of their staff. And it was also rolled out in conjunction with a compliance regime that penalized employers and put them at risk of really oppressive measures if they weren't complying with the terms of the LMIA in terms of salary and whatnot, or if there was any suspicion. But that whole process, that whole mindset was aimed at diminishing opportunities for foreign workers, and it was applied across the board. So there's a lot of companies that were impacted by it. It was a hard and fast rule applied across the board. Hard and fast rules often result in unfair application.
So is that forcing people who maybe would have been here temporarily to now be forced to come as permanent residents?
Well, it denied opportunities for workers, first of all. And in a large measure, being a worker here was an important step in becoming a permanent resident.
Mm-hmm.
But what they did with express entry a year later they put in the express entry. And the express entry only works as well as those comprehensive ranking scores work, the scores that you have to obtain in order to get pulled out of the pool.
Mm-hmm.
When they gave bonus points only to workers who had work permits supported by an LMIA, then they put a high demand on getting LMIAs.
But wait a second. You just said this LMIA was to keep people out.
Exactly.
And now you're saying that you need the LMIA to get in.
Exactly.
So we're in a push-pull.
They forced people, they put the PR program in a restrictive system. A system that was intended to deny opportunity for foreign workers was then made a requirement of becoming a permanent resident. So obviously
Which is what my question is were they trying to shift people from being temporary to permanent?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. I mean, you know, what they promised industry and why this report is so scathing. And it is a scathing indictment about the failure of express entry. Originally, express entry was supposed to be called an expression of interest program.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was you expressed your interest to come to Canada, and we didn't make you pay any money until we invited you to apply.
Right.
And then we would, only then we would take your money when we were sure we could process you quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not an unreasonable trade-off. But what industry said is, well, how does this help us? We've made job offers. You, government, we expect you to give people that, to fill our job shortages, we expect you to process those people quickly. And the government said, absolutely, we will do that. We commit to doing that. You'll be partners in this process. And industry, right up until December of 2014, did feel they were partners in the process, when at the last minute, the highest point totals that were obtainable were only obtainable if you had an LMIA.
That's the part we were talking about.
And
yeah.
let me make this point. And it's a point made in the paper by the
I
Congress.
want to save a little bit of this for the second half of the show
understand.
because we're going to talk a lot about this report.
But you asked me why they did it.
Yeah.
And when we say they, we mean the Conservative government in 2014, 2015. They turned the foreign worker program into a political issue. They saw that there were political points. They thought they could mine political points by arguing that they were protecting jobs for Canadians first and restricting abuses of the foreign worker program. And this is how they sold the LMIA process. I think they thought that they made good headway on that.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody challenged them on it.
It was a good headline for them.
It was a good headline. It seemed like a good idea to carry that political platform into the permanent resident application process, and for that reason it was implemented into the express entry. I don't know when that decision was made. I'm guessing that it was made in 2015. They were awfully quiet about it. And then when they implemented it into the permanent resident program, all hell broke loose.
And the reason for that is we expected people, up till now, our system has always treated people that lawfully obtained a work permit for an employer through, let's say, the North American Free Trade Agreement, where you're exempt from a labor market impact assessment if you're a professional or an intercompany transferee, or through our free trade agreements with Korea, with Chile, with Colombia,
soon to be Europe, maybe.
to the
Another year or two.
Trans-Pacific Partnership,
Yep.
or if you were here on a student exchange or working holiday program. you didn't have to have a labor market impact assessment. Yet the whole point was, if you had a job and an employer, why should you have to have a double layer of support in order to get the benefit of this for permanent residence? This is the part that made no sense to us, and certainly has as the Canadian Bar Association and our members, but also didn't make any sense to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And they were floored when they saw it, because all of a sudden, anyone who was had a work permit through another means was disqualified from having the highest number of points. And when you look at it, the number of work permits that were out there that were not pursuant to labor market opinions was far greater than the ones that were issued for labor market.
So that meant that you carved off a whole group of people that could potentially come in.
For no particularly good reason.
All right, so I just want to talk about what we're going to speak about for the rest of the show, because you're going to a lot to say about this. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has 450 boards of trade or chambers of commerce across the country. They paid for this study about express entry and the impact it's had on their members across the country. Now, Gordon, one word, how would you describe this report?
Scathing.
Scathing, that's a good word.
Yeah, you're both going to go with scathing. Yeah. All right, so when we come back, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the report focused on and what the recommendations are and how bad it is. Scathing, obviously. So you're going to want to stick around. After the break, we're speaking with Gordon Maynard and Alec Stojcevic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. They're specialists in immigration and citizenship law, and we're going to talk about this report when we come back next on The Law Show on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.